Hi, my name is Paul Sellers. I'm the TUC's Pay Policy Officer, and today we're going to be speaking about bargaining for the real living wage. I should just introduce myself. I'm the Pay Policy here, a Pay Policy Officer, but in years gone by I've been a steward for about 30 years on and off for a number of different unions, so I've done a bit of pay bargaining out in the real world as well as being here at the TUC. So. And I also sit on the Living Wage Foundation board, so I'm pretty close to the course of the Living Wage as well. Let's have a look today at what the webinar will cover. But first, just to say that there are a number of ways to participate. You can ask questions and vote your favourite, answer the polls. There'll be a link below the presentation. And you can comment or chat by clicking on, say, something nice on bottom right. Say what you want. Okay, so I should summarise what we're hoping to cover today in this webinar. This is about equipping stewards and activists to bargain or to campaign for the real living wage. So I'm going to cover what the real living wage actually is and where did it come from, why we need this real living wage, and also because it's nice to have some good news as well in this naughty old world, that we're actually winning. So we'll be talking a bit about some of our victories on this, and the real living wage actually is getting paid by more and more employers every year, so that's a bit of good news. I want to also cover how this fits in with broader TUC campaigning and trade union campaigning around pay and around good jobs. Just say a few words about that before going on to the nuts and bolts of how we actually bargain or run campaigns for the living wage. And when we do that, I'll be talking about the union case. I'll be talking about the reasons why employers actually adopt the real living wage, sometimes on their own without pressure from unions or employees. So that's something to work with, and how we actually build a campaign. And one important thing, when we win, how we celebrate our victories, because that's a bit we often forget. So I'm going to say up front what the real living wage is. It's a voluntary standard, and it's something that trade unions are bargaining for. Many trade unions are using the real living wage as the bottom rate in their pay claims, and many employers are indeed adopting it, as I said. To say what it is, it's higher than the national minimum wage, this voluntary standard, and the current living wage rates, very important to know this, is £10.20 if you're in the London area, and £8.75 in the rest of the UK. Now, the minimum wage, national minimum wage, we're familiar with. That's been around since 1998. That's the legal minimum standard on pay. That's something else, not the real living wage. And I'll say what that is, though, because we should know that too. £7.50 for those aged 25 and above. A lower figure, £7.05 for those 21 to 24, and then it goes down with age, £5.60 for those 18 to 20-year-old, down to £4.05 for those 16 to 17. And for apprentices, this is where it gets a little complicated on the national minimum wage, that legal minimum standard on pay. For apprentices, if they're under 19 or they're in the first year of their apprentice and they're a bit older, then the minimum wage there is £3.50, so quite low. So we can see that the real living wage is quite a higher standard, and we've actually expressed this on a slide. I don't know if we can we share that on the screen, Anna? So I'm just asking my assistant to and support vital support worker to. Just to show you that that block diagram, so you can see that the real living wage is a higher standard, as I described, quite a way above the national minimum wage. let's say who the living wage applies to, the real living wage. To be accredited, to be a proper real living wage employer, a company or an employer has to pay all its direct staff, if they're aged 18 and above, the real living wage. The only exceptions are, and there are exceptions, because like everything, this is a bit of a compromise. The exceptions are interns and apprentices, but it doesn't just stop with direct employees. No, it also applies to contract workers, to agency workers who work on the premises, and there's a standard written into the accreditation process for the real living wage that it has to be paid to anyone who's on the premises for more than a couple of hours a week. So it catches all the contractors, like the cleaners, like security staff, like any catering staff, but it doesn't catch someone who's delivering, I don't know, bottled water or paper supplies or whatever. It doesn't catch someone who's delivering. So the other thing to say, just to describe how this real living wage works, is it's announced in November, and some employers simply put up their rates in November, but they actually have until April the following year to get those rates up to the real living wage. And of course, the national minimum wage, the legal minimum standard, the other thing that everyone must comply with, that also goes up in April. So let's just dwell on how much more the real living wage is. I mean, it's simple maths, you know already. You probably worked it out in your heads. The gap is between the real living wage for the whole of the UK and the national minimum wage, the legal minimum for pay, is actually 125. If you're in London and your employer adopts the real living wage, that gap's a fair bit bigger. It's £2.70 an hour, in fact, more. So that's reflecting the cost of living in London, where particularly property prices and rents are very high. Let's move on and just say where this came from, this real living wage, because the idea that you should be paid a living wage has been around for a long time. It really has been around for an awful long time, and it's probably the only thing that the following people ever agreed on. If they'd ever met, they would have agreed that people should be paid a living wage for their work, because it was supported by Adam Smith, the 18th century economist, a free market economist, by Pope Leo the 13th, by Winston Churchill, and by Franklin Roosevelt, and that's a group of people who probably wouldn't get on if they had a dinner party, but they all believed that people should be paid enough to live on. So that idea has been around a long time, but how do you actually make it work? How do you make sure people get a living wage? Well, we've had attempts in the past in the UK. We had trades boards and then wages councils for some of the low-paid sectors. They're now all abolished, apart from the agricultural wages boards, which still operate in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, but not in England. Modern campaign, which is what we're really interested in, started in 2001, and the trigger was the development of Canary Wharf. So all those big office blocks, all the bank headquarters, moving to Canary Wharf, and really well-paid jobs sitting alongside districts in the East End, which of course there's plenty of people who don't earn very much or even in poverty. And what happened was that community groups and unions got together and they said, what can we do about this? Because it's an opportunity. It's very, very stark thing there, to have all that wealth sitting next to the poverty. And Unison, GMB, T&G were recruiting amongst some of the bank headquarters. They got together and they said we ought to have a standard for the living wage, a minimum pay rate, separate from the statutory, the legal national minimum wage, and higher, of course. And the initial calculation was done by a friendly academic at the University in Loughborough, we was already working with the charity body, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which campaigns against poverty and low incomes. What they did was they got some focus groups together. They got people from this area, from the East End, together, and they had some really long and complicated focus groups, but the gist of what they were asking them was, how much do you need to live on to have a simple but decent life? So it's that simple. What do you really need to live on and not be in poverty? And the debates were, quite long and heated sometimes, because there were questions like, do you really need a car? Well, certainly outside London, you do need a car. In London, you need access to the travel network. Do you need a holiday? And they decided that in these focus groups, they decided that you needed at least 1 week away on holiday somewhere in England. So that's the kind of thing that went into the standard. And then for a lot of complicated maths, that's boiled down to an hourly rate. So there were some early wins as well. Straight away there were some early wins from this campaign. Some of the bank headquarters started becoming living wage employers and paying their cleaners, in particular, cleaning contracts, because you've got these people, coming from nearby, to work in these bank headquarters, multi-billion pound businesses in some cases, and being paid the minimum wage. So great to see some early wins there. Then the next thing that happened was that some local authorities started to set their own living wages. Again, not a legal standard, but these local authorities pay, raised the bottom rates for their own employees, and they tried to exhort other businesses in the area to pay. And so that happened in a number of the big cities, Manchester, Glasgow, and others, but also in some towns you might expect, Oxford, Brighton. One or two more surprising ones, like maybe Preston, set its own living wage. And so the numbers were creeping up. They were creeping up in 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s a year, but we were moving forward. In 2005, then, the London Mayor at the time, Ken Livingstone, calculated for the first time an official living wage for London, and successive mayors have continued to support that. So again, numbers carried on creeping upwards, as the mayor was particularly recruiting businesses in London. 2010, the campaign became much more professionalised. First of all, the Living Wage Foundation was set up with the help of a big grant from a charity in order to accredit and promote the living wage. And secondly, a summit was held, and all the local authorities and all the other campaigners were brought together, and they decided there should be one living wage rate for England. And that was a hard debate, because some of these local authorities had worked hard and had a lot invested in their living wages, but ultimately it was holding back accreditation, holding back employers from adopting the living wage, because there were different rates here, there and everywhere else. So a big step forward to get to that stage. I should mention political parties as well, just briefly. They have been keen on the living wage, and the last generation of party leaders, particularly used to say a lot about it. There's been a slight change of emphasis towards raising the national minimum wage, legal standard, in recent years. I think there's room for both approaches. We obviously want to see a higher minimum wage, but that's not where our ambitions stops. There must be employers who will be willing and able to pay more, and we need to make sure we continue to make the most of that. So I should just say about the speed of accreditation really took off after 2010. It really went almost ballistic, I was going to say. So 100 employers were accredited in the first year in 2010. It was 200 by 2012. In 2013, it had gone up to 500, more than doubled. Now, at the end of 2017, it was announced that it had passed 3,000 employers paying the real living wage, and I think the current total is just over 3,200. So we are winning. We are making progress with this campaign. And I should stress why the real living wage is needed, because actually society and work isn't delivering what it should do at the moment. There's a real failing in the way pay is going in particular. And the rise of in-work poverty in particular is associated with rather less trade union coverage. Where there's collective bargaining, people don't do too badly, even when we're pushed by employers, even in the public sector where there's a pay gap. When you get out into the non-union sector, then minimum standards apply when they're not broken. So it can even be worse than that. So of course we need to turn that round, and that's why we're talking today about bargaining and campaigning on the living wage. It's a good fit with trade union arguments. It's easy to understand. It's very easy to understand the social justice argument that work should pay enough to live on. How could it pay less? So when people move up to the real living wage, that does make a real difference. We can see the gap is as big as it is. It's enough to make a difference. Right at the moment, 1 in 5 employees are earning less than a living wage, though. That's 6.2 million employees earning less than that minimum that you need to live on and not be in poverty. A couple more statistics: 3.2 million adults in work are also in poverty. And to look at it the other way around, 55% of adults who are in poverty are also in work. So that's just over half of those who are in poverty are also in work. So the minimum wage can make a real difference. And I've got a couple of quotes just to share, which I think help set that out. These are from people who've actually moved on to the living wage, having previously been paid the national minimum wage. First quote, this is from a young mother. Being paid the living wage means I don't have to choose between buying a winter coat and buying birthday presents for my children. Not much more to say. I had, from a young Asian father, I had to work 2 jobs just to put food on the table and pay the rent. When I got the living wage, I was able to drop 1 job. Now I have more time for my family. He also says that he started a community group with the time that's been freed up. So this is, not only good for working people, it's also, I would say, good for society that people aren't paid less than the real living wage. There's a lot of support for that. This standard. For workers, it's obvious, isn't it? It's what you might expect. We should be paid enough to live on. From employers, it's a bit surprising. It's a bit complex because many want to do the right thing, but there are also some business reasons why it may pay for itself, which I'll come on to. And from the public, from members of the public, it's about fairness, it's about ethical concerns. There are some people that, a big group of people who don't want to buy from Scrooge companies. They want to buy from what I might call a nice company, not from the nasty one. And that's why such a wide range of employers are signing up. There's really a surge of support, and we want to use this to build into our pay rises and therefore to enable us to recruit more members. I'll mention an opinion poll from the Living Wage Foundation. They conducted this opinion poll at the end of 2017. So 87% of the public think companies should pay the real living wage. It's becoming an accepted standard, rather. 90% of consumers think that pay should reflect living costs. So those are pretty big numbers. So let's just think about some of the details of how we're winning, because the numbers are going up. As I said, 3,200 are now accredited employers, and it's kind of a little hard to estimate how many workers that actually benefits, for reasons you can imagine. You're trying to count every employee in every company that was below living wage. We do try to do that, and so does the Living Wage Foundation. So we're pretty close. We've got a pretty good answer. We think it benefits around 200,000 employees, and that's the least it can benefit. That's an estimate on the low end. Let's say who are these companies, because I said there were a wide range. Includes 1/3 of what they call the FTSE 100, the largest companies in the UK. But there's all shapes and sizes of companies that are accredited as well. I like to think from the Afghan Rug Shop Limited, a very small company, to the Welsh Government, a very different kind of enterprise. 1,850 private sector employers are accredited. 350 public sector employers, which is perhaps a little surprising. That's despite the pay cap. And 1,000 employers in the voluntary sector, both large and small. Let's come on to the meat now, because that's what it is now. How do we get it? So this bit is about how we run campaigns, how we bargain for the real living wage. And for broader campaigning, that's I mean by broader campaigning for stuff that goes outside places where there are unions, we need to think about how this fits. I mean, the real living wage is our only concern. But we're set in a context where pay growth has not recovered from the 2008 recession. I should just say where this fits into trade union concerns before I move on to the nuts and bolts of bargaining. Earnings at the moment, on average, are growing by 2.4% a year. Just a couple of figures here. You can measure inflation in different ways. CPI is a common way of doing it. That's 3%. RPI, traditionally used in trade union pay bargaining, 4%. Whichever measure you choose, the pay growth figure is lower. So that's not great. That means that the real value of your pay is shrinking because prices are rising faster. And we tried to address this. TUC tried to address this from 2014 onwards with our Britain Needs a Pay Rise campaign, which was all about what it said on the tin there, a very simple message. We were surprised. The main victory from that is that the Chancellor of the day took our words, said Britain deserves a pay rise and it's going to get one. What that was about was creating a new rate of the national minimum wage, the legal minimum standard, and making a commitment to raise that 60% of median earnings by 2020. So that campaign had an impact. That means that the national minimum wage is probably going to cover 2.5 million people by 2020. It covered about half of that in 2015. So that's going to push that one up. But of course, we're also thinking now about good jobs. That's our current campaign is about great jobs, and that's much broader. It's about thinking about far beyond pay and into all the other things that we care about. So Great Jobs for All talks about voice at work, collective bargaining, fair and decent pay. That's what this is about, this session. Regular hours, fair treatment and respect, healthy workplaces, of course, very important. Access to learning, progression at work, all those things. But one strand of that is fair and decent pay, and within that, one important strand is trying to get the real living wage as the minimum standard. So that's what we're about. So let's come on to actually talk about thinking about bargaining for the living wage. And I'm going to start here in a workplace where we have recognition. That's going to be my first focus. necessarily any campaign where you have trade union recognition and you're already bargaining with the employer has to be a bit more inward facing than a campaign that's outside somewhere where you don't have a union recognition. So I think I've got a little checklist for what you should do to run a campaign, and I'm going to go through that quickly if I can. I guess the first point, as always, with any campaigning is contact a union. Almost goes without saying, but I should say it, because they'll have good advice. This won't be the first time there's been a living wage campaign that the unions run. They'll have campaign materials. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. You know, let's get what we can from the union before we go on to think about our own specific campaign in our workplace. I mean, the second thing I would say is to try to muster some of the arguments around the living, why employers should adopt the living wage. Some are simple, some are a little bit more complex. And here the Living Wage Foundation website is quite a good resource because they've got just those arguments on there. It's particularly handy to know why employers will voluntarily sign up to pay more. So that's a useful thing to get a grip on. And there's loads of useful information and reports there, including the business case for the real living wage. Also useful to know who pays the real living wage. There's a list on the Living Wage Foundation website, and it's easy to find employers that are a bit like yours. So that's always a handy thing to know. You know, which employers in my sector, in my kind of business, are real living wage employers. I mean, for working people and unions, I mean, the argument is pretty simple. It's all about fairness. How on earth could we earn less than the real living wage? It's automatically unfair. That's easy. You know, we can say that, and it's right. But to use a bit of judo, if you like, a bit of mental judo, for employers, it's slightly more complex. There are strands to why employers pick up the real living wage and support it. And I mean, the first one is actually you know, something they should get praise for. I think that there are many employers, many companies, many voluntary sector organisations, many public sector bodies want to do the right thing, and we should help them to do the right thing, because that's what our members are going to want. Where it gets in helping them, I mean, it's handy to have some arguments about how they pay for it, which are easy to find, and that's because that helps those who want to do the right thing to convince those within that employer. They're not all a monolith. They don't all think the same thing within every company or employer. The CEO or the leader or the personnel director may need to convince some other people, the finance director, the owners, shareholders, councillors, if it's a local authority, that this is good value for money. Luckily, there are a whole lot of reasons why paying the real living wage may well pay for itself. So it's not a win-lose game. I mean, what we need to show is that it's a win-win game. And there are a couple of benefits, two kinds of benefits, I think, for employers. I mean, one is reputation. Your reputation as an employer and as a company, as a council, as a body is going to be improved if you adopt the real living wage. So that's pretty easy to understand. It works best for customer-facing businesses, of course, those who actually have an interface with the public. But that's a strong consideration. The other one is there's another side to that as well, actually, where there are real living wage demos. Actually, one motivation maybe the employer wants to stop out having those demos outside the shop or the office or the company because it's lowering their reputation. So that's the other side of the coin. But there are also some I'm going to call personnel and operational benefits to paying the real living wage. Personnel benefits, widely studied and can stand it up. There's evidence, as I say, on the Real Living Wage Foundation website, the personnel benefits, you recruit from a wider pool if you pay more, no surprise. And this is not a phrase I would use, but I've heard it said, you get better workers, better recruits, and that's probably right. You keep them longer, better retention in personnel terms, and actually, guess what? They're better motivated because they see you as a good employer because you pay more than the minimum wage, the minimum legal standard that they have to pay you. So the other part of the benefits for employers is around operational benefits. Some are reporting that productivity goes up, which is also an important benefit. Some are reporting that standard of work goes up. One that comes to mind to me is KPMG. The accountants have written up that when their cleaning contract went living wage, the standard of cleaning improved, and that was a benefit worth having. They let out rooms, they have a facilities business, better cleaning is good commercial sense. So it's useful to get hold of some of these arguments as they're actually the most persuasive for employers. I guess also on my checklist is, at an early stage, it's worth thinking about how you build a team, what roles are needed, who does what. We shouldn't try to do everything ourselves. Basically, we should have a team. What roles do we need? Maybe organiser, spokesperson, secretary, even researcher. If there's looking at some of those arguments, the old saying "many hands make light work" is relevant here, I think, and having a team makes success more likely. I just want to. Before I move on, I just want to cut back and mention one or two of the quantifying the business benefits, because again, I'm going to draw on research from the Living Wage Foundation, and they surveyed all their members again towards the end of 2017. 86% of those who signed up to the Living Wage, 86% of employers said it enhanced their reputation. That's a big number. 75% said it improved motivation and retention of their staff. Again, that's a worthwhile benefit if you're running a business. 64% said it helped to differentiate their business from others. So in other words, to say we're different, we do things a different way, we pay living wage. And 58% said it improved relations with staff. Not a bad thing. So if you're going to go into bargaining, you've got your team, you've got some arguments, know about how the real living wage works, and now you need to decide on your strategy. It's a good plan to decide on your strategy for moving forward. Again, it's a little checklist, I guess, and this is about some of the standard things that we should do as unions. I guess point one is always making sure that you're in contact with your members, that they know what it's all about, they know what the real living wage is, and that they support your claim. That's a very important point. I tend to think everyone's heard of the living wage. Of course they haven't. Some won't know what it is. Some may be worried even. I mean, some members may be worried that if you're going to have the real living wage and pay's going to go up at the bottom, that's they may worry about differentials. That's the gap between myself and the lowest paid is being squeezed. And they may think that those workers on the bottom pay rate are getting too big a share of the wages pie, if you like. I mean, these are all valid concerns, and they need to be managed. But really, the shoe is pinching hardest on those who are on the bottom rates, those who are in work poverty. So we should try to manage that. And I guess it's helpful, in particular, if there's some people we know are struggling, and we need to do this with sensitivity. But if we know it's going to help, some people who are struggling and maybe quite popular in the organisation, that's going to be a helpful contribution to taking it forward. I guess then the next thing is to, again, we're talking about collective bargaining here, is to draw it into your pay claim. That's simple. And that may look something like, the example that I'm going to say now is drawn from local government pay claim for England and Wales, so a real pay claim put in 2017. All staff shall have a 5% pay rise, and the bottom grade should be raised. The bottom grade should be raised up to the real living wage. So that's a simple way of building this real living wage claim into your pay claim. Then I guess the third point is to plan your pitch to your employer. What are you going to say? You probably need to write it down. You may even read it aloud to yourself to make sure it sounds persuasive. It's going to include something about fairness. It's, fair treatment. You must be paid at least the living wage. How can you be paid less? It may well include something about reputation, and may mention some of those business benefits, because it's good if you do. Because actually you're trying to persuade employers that this is good for them, and indeed many employers are saying that it is good for them, so that's a helpful resource to have of it. I think maybe the next stage is to think about timetable a little bit. When are you going to put in your pay claim, but questions you might want to consider are you going to get to the real living wage in one year? Is that feasible? Is that what your members want? Because if they need longer, there's no harm. There's no harm in thinking about a strategy where it's phased in over a short period, maybe a couple of years. It could be done. Employers can still get accredited if they have a short phase-in period. They can still be accredited by the Real Living Wage Foundation. What you need is to show that you have a proper plan as an employer, some agreed milestones, and of course in making sure that it's a proper agreement, Living Wage Foundation will check they're meeting the milestones as they go along. It helps if it's agreed with unions, because that makes it much more likely that it's going to happen, because we're going to be checking it as well. Unions are going to be checking that progress is made. So that's an option. Obviously we want what pay at the bottom to rise as quickly as possible, but it is possible. It's also possible to think about phasing, or even as a plan B, because you need a plan B. What if they say no? You must have a plan B. I mean, that needs some thought. I mean, is the employer, again, we talked about timing and timetabling. Is the employer going for a bad patch? Is it going to get better? Will there be a good time to do this? But if you are where you are, how do you put pressure on? Maybe you keep highlighting vacancies and skill shortages and unfilled vacancies and turnover, all those kind of things that influence management. Maybe also you look to see who made the decision. It's not the final decision maker. Maybe it was a personnel person who was negotiating with you, but there are other layers of management higher up, ultimately the chief executive or the leader of the council and so on. So there are other people you can approach, and that may be a way of getting around a blockage. Certainly the thing to do is to have a plan to keep out the pressure. So I'm going to move on to talk about campaigning for the real living wage in cases where the employer doesn't actually recognise a trade union. And that's a little bit different. Some of the things are similar, but it's a little bit different because it's a more outward-facing approach. It's leafleting against your employer can get you into trouble if you've got collective bargaining and you work for them. If you don't work there and you're trying to recruit members, then leafleting doesn't get you into trouble, basically. So it's that kind of thing. It's a more outward-facing approach. Again, you need my little checklist. Some of it's the same. Certainly, communication with your members and people in the campaign is good. Communication with the people who work for the employer that you're targeting is also vital, as much as you can, because you need to know that the people you're campaigning on behalf of are actually going to support what you're asking for. So lines of communication and that communication is vital. In this case, talking about general campaigning where there's not collective bargaining, also important, I think, second thing on my checklist would be to build a coalition of support. Now, who else might be in that? Other unions, of course, faith groups, community groups, maybe the local authority if they're sympathetic, some are, some not so much. Maybe even progressive businesses. They might be a bit wary of telling other employers what to do, but they might be held up as examples. Again, you need a plan, and of course it's worth, in this plan, I would say it's worth talking to the employer first. They may be sympathetic. The best way to find out is to ask them. I would suggest perhaps taking a delegation, maybe if you've got that coalition that I talked about in building a coalition, some civil society voices, even some customers, would be more persuasive. And the ideal pitch again to the employer would include both fairness, both reputation, and something about the personnel and the operational productivity and so on benefits that many employers are reporting for when they've adopted the real living wage. If the employer is negative, and they may be, traditional campaign methods can easily be used. In some cases, you may even think it's better to warm the employer up a little bit by having a demonstration first or something like that. But traditional campaign methods, well-known demonstrations, leaflets, posters, old school letters, email, petitions, all those kind of things that we're very familiar with. You might also think, because we're now looking outside, we're not just looking within our own employer, you may also consider using the media to put your case. And that's a good thing. If you're confident to do that, that's a very good thing to do. So local papers, local radio, local TV are all there to be used if you learn how to use them. Local papers particularly are very under pressure, time pressure at the moment. Where I live, one journalist seems to be writing 3 papers, so they don't have a lot of spare time. But they really love a press release that can be cut and pasted and put straight into the paper. So it's good to study the writing style they use of it and try to write it a bit like that, because they will simply do that. Then they will simply cut and paste it. Local radio and telly, to some extent, local telly love conflict stories. You might want to be prepared, for example, to argue with someone from the employer's side on a local radio show. If you're prepared to do that as a good story there for local radio straight away. And of course, they say, the old saying is that a picture speaks 1,000 words. That's absolutely true. And a good photo opportunity of a demo or something like that, handing in a letter to an employer, that's always a very good thing to have. If you're doing a demo, you probably need to just make sure that you've got enough people to make it look like a crowd scene, as it were. So probably 15, 20 people at least. So that's an important thing to do. So set a timetable of events for the campaign, keep up the pressure. And that's, onward to success, as we say. So the next thing is really what we do when we win, because we are winning on living wage campaigns quite a lot. So there's a fair chance that campaigns will have to will win, people will get more money, and then we work out what we do about celebrating it, because this is an important stage. If we've got the living wage, the real living wage, in an agreement, if we won a campaign, so someone's adopted it, now we need to celebrate the victory. This should be the best bit, it should be the easy bit, but sometimes we're not very good as trade unionists as celebrating victory, so we probably just better think about it a little bit and spell it out. And the key point is employers will want to take the credit, and that's a rule of life, I think, because if they're a company, if they're a private sector company, they want to show how good they are, how nice they are. If they're a local politician, they want to show how progressive they are, so they'll want the credit. So the goal at this stage is to make sure that we get a share of the credit, our fair share. We've been campaigning for this, we've got it, and we need to be part of the victory. Your members will know that you've been campaigning, and they should, when you win, they should hear it from you, or you and the employer at the same time, not from the employer first. So again, a couple of tips. Agree the timing of an announcement with the employer when you win the campaign and you get the real living wage. Question for the employer: will there be a press release? If there is, there ought to be a quote from the union in it, because we've been in this, we've won it, we deserve some of the credit, and we want people to know, both inside the employer and outside, that we won, because we want more people to join unions. And this is a fantastic advert when we win the real living wage. So celebrating victory is a very important stage of any campaign, and it sometimes gets a bit forgotten. So I'm coming to the end of my remarks, but I want to say a little bit about some of those victories before we stop and have a discussion and take questions. We often win. Even if we don't get everything we want, we often have more than when we started with, because in some of these real living wage campaigns where the employer moves halfway, they don't get to the real living wage, they still raise pay for those at the bottom, and that's going to be a good thing. And of course, in some other cases, the campaign's ongoing. So just to talk about a few examples of where we've had a successful campaign, where we've simply won the real living wage. A few victories drawn at random. From banking, HSBC, Barclays, from the world of local authorities, every Scottish local authority. That's good. Heathrow Airport, biggest airport in the UK. There are many others, but those are just a few examples. Bigger pay rises, moving on to bigger pay rises, one for low paid workers, but not quite reaching the living wage. Well known as the Ritzy Cinema strike, so part of the Picture House chain. Back to strike, now part of Prospect. Some local authorities have done similar things, quite a few local authorities, so they've raised pay for staff, directly employed staff, and even for some contractors. Many of them struggle a bit in the current climate where money is tight, and particularly around social care, but we've got many examples of local authorities where pay has gone up because of living wage campaigns. And other campaigns are going on in pretty well every sector. There are ongoing real living wage campaigns in local government, hospitals, universities, hotel and retail chains. There's quite a lot of low pay. Cleaners in all sectors, including a huge contractor, ABM, on the railway network. That's an RMT campaign. I can mention pretty well every union that deals with low paid workers, but I'm just picking a few out at random here. Let's finish with just a handful of a few more examples of unionised private sector companies who paid a real living wage. Again, from a random selection of victories and of sectors. Arriva Rail, caterers and cleaners, the trains. IKEA, the chain, a shop. ITV, they have cleaners and caterers. And the football clubs, some of the football clubs, Chelsea, West Ham, Everton, Liverpool. Sorry if your team isn't in that list. I hope there will be soon. Now, football clubs might seem a bit of an odd one because we hear about the highly paid strikers, members of the Professional Footballers Association, one of the TUC unions, but they're actually supported by an army of low paid workers from retail, caterers, stewards, cleaning, and so on. And some of these football clubs pretty profitable, hugely profitable in the Premier League, but rely on low wages. So it's been a good target. And I bring them up to illustrate that we're winning on the real living wage. And now the trick is to take the campaign forward, to take it into every corner of the economy, private sector, public sector, and voluntary sector alike. So that's what I wanted to say on the real living wage. So I'm going to ask Anna, have we got any questions or comments?
Yes, we have. We've had a question from Adam. He says, in squeezed workplaces, what effective arguments can we provide when employers state that to offer a higher wage would mean job losses elsewhere, particularly where redundancies are common? In this scenario, it's often difficult to get members on board as they would rather suffer pay suppression than potentially lose their jobs, which is the option often given.
Yeah, so not an easy question, but I mean, I think we have to think more broadly in that kind of case. And by thinking more broadly, I know that in some cases, unions and the Living Wage Foundation have been doing a bit of work to try to make businesses more profitable, particularly in retail, and that's thinking through, why the business is squeezed. Now, in some cases, we may get a bit stuck because if you're in social care, for example, you're dependent on what the local authority will pay you, and that's a bit difficult. In others, we might think more broadly about, almost about going back to the, seems like an old-fashioned idea now, but it should be a new idea, bargaining about productivity and how we make the workplace more efficient. And part of the reward for that should be more pay. So that's not easy. That's a bit of a long run and a comprehensive strategy. And it's going to take a while, but that perhaps might be the way out of it. Squeezed workplaces are obviously the more difficult ones.
Okay, we've had a question from Matt. He asks, in general terms of wages, what is the best way to try and remove the stigma of colleagues discussing their salaries with a view of promoting bargaining for higher wages or equality?
Yeah, there are companies and employers where salaries can be a bit secret, and I've never understood that. I mean, I can only think that's counterproductive for the employer, but so really it's a question about getting more transparency about pay. Why is pay secret? Why would pay be secret? In some cases, because employers are doing stupid things, paying new people more than established people doing the same job, and they don't want that known. I can understand that. In which case, you're going to have a job to move them away from secrecy because they'll be revealing the trick they played. There is almost like, in some companies, there is almost a culture of secrecy. It's almost like this is what we do. So we're copying the way the City of London behaves. I mean, it really almost has to start with a culture of greater transparency, and that's and there are some ways of getting at that. I mean, one is around making sure that people get equal pay, because to be sure that people are equal pay under law. I mean, across all the characteristics like race, gender, disability, and so on. And unless there's been some form of job evaluation in the line in the past, then there's no way of being sure and demonstrating that people are paid equally. Now, if there's been some form of job evaluation, you've probably got a series of grades, and you've probably got, it may not be published, but it'll be there, and you'll have some points on those grades, and then you've got employers making some ad hoc decisions. So we're finding it a bit hard to get someone to do X, so we'll pay more for that. We've got too many applicants for Y, so we'll pay a bit less. They may run into equal pay problems, and maybe the argument is around greater transparency to protect employers so that they're seen to be fair, so they don't run into legal problems, so a little bit of fear introduced. Maybe it's also about talking to colleagues and trying to find out why, if they're reluctant to reveal their salaries. It's an offence in some companies, but if they're reluctant and they may be willing to talk about it, they may be willing to change in discussion. So I can't think of a magic wand, but it's those kind of areas that we need to look at: equality and transparency.
We've got a question from Alison. She says, I'm a professional working for a local authority who hasn't had a pay rise in 6 years. As the national minimum wage and real living wage increases, which is brilliant for the lowest paid workers, what will happen to ensure that the wages of others reflect the narrowing wage gap for slightly higher paid workers to ensure that the increase is passed up the chain?
Yeah. I started to touch briefly in the seminar. I mean, the real living wage cannot be the only trade union concern. It's a useful instrument, but it is a single pay rate. And of course, if you're on, let's say, for example, you're on £12 an hour and you haven't had a pay rise for 5 years, then the real living wage isn't going to help you. So we're also campaigning against the public sector pay cap, and for more resources into the public sector. Government's started to soften a little bit, but nowhere near as much as we like, of course, on that one. And while that's going on, it's actually quite difficult. But I would be looking at some of the local authorities that have actually introduced the real living wage, because not everyone's had a pay freeze. You know, not every local authority has had a pay freeze every year for the last 5 years. It's played out differently, and while the average increases may be quite low outside of the minimum wage and living wage increases, there have been increases. If your authority is not giving you anything, then they're doing rather worse for you than many other local authorities. And I guess unions can only do what they can, because councillors and councils can be difficult. Sure, you know. But I guess drawing on some comparisons and trying to do it through collective bargaining, you know, it's quite difficult. It's hard to go outside without getting into trouble with your employer. But it almost needs a few people not clearly associated or identified with the union. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of water. That's better, getting a little dry there. It almost needs some people who are not employees, who can't be identified as kind of spouses or partners or relatives to do a bit of campaigning on your behalf as well, because times may be tough for a lot of people, but there's no way it's fair for someone to get a pay freeze for 5 years, and that can't be sustained.
And a final question from Carrie. In their workplace, they have agency cleaners, and they suspect they aren't being paid the living wage. How can they find out if they are?
If it's a real living wage accredited employer, e.g. they're accredited as paying the living wage by the Living Wage Foundation, then they should be willing to tell you. So that's the easy one. If you're campaigning for the real living wage and you're trying to find out whether cleaners are paid, it may be that your employer won't tell you. You may have asked them and been, start by asking the employer, of course, but they may say it's none of your business. You may also do the obvious thing and ask cleaners what they're paid. Again, they might be frightened to tell you, or they may tell you. Otherwise, it's a bit more difficult, I think. But those are the easy ways of getting at it. And I guess, you know, if the cleaner has contracts elsewhere that you know of in your locality, in your region, then you may be able to find some news about what they're doing as well. So there's no dead easy way, because it depends on the circumstances, but it's possible to crack the code of secrecy in some cases at least. Okay, so we've got no more questions at the moment. I think unless there's a burning issue coming up in the next few seconds, I don't think so. No, we've definitely exhausted our conversation for today. But thanks for joining me very much. And the real living wage has been useful for us. Not always dead easy, as some of the questions have shown, but we are winning on that, and we're getting more and more employers to do it. So talk to your union; they'll have resources, and good luck with campaigning. I want to hear about your successes when you win. So thanks very much.